Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Tinatin Japaridze, an analyst with Eurasia Group. Tinatin, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be back with you, Brittany.
Tinatin, I appreciate the conversation because you always come on when there are developments, significant developments in the war between Russia and Ukraine, as well as the United States' involvement, and you break them down. And I think right now is a perfect time for another one of those conversations. And I want to start this conversation with what we saw last week in the White House meeting between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and then we can work our way around that. One report characterized this meeting as acrimonious, another characterized it as tense. President Trump reportedly said in the meeting that Ukraine needed to concede land to Russia in order for the war to end, and he did not give the Ukrainian side Tomahawk missiles, which is reportedly what Volodymyr Zelensky went in there wanting. And President Trump also, after the meeting, he said that he believed there should be a ceasefire at the current battle lines as the launch pad for negotiations. And this was something that Zelensky was on board with. So to start off the conversation, what do you make of the news that came out of that meeting?
As you said, Brittany, the meeting was indeed, based on the reports that we've seen, tense, to say the least. President Trump reportedly did press Volodymyr Zelensky to consider territorial concessions over the Donbas specifically, which I believe that the White House has since denied, but those are the reports that we're hearing continuously. And importantly, despite the friction, there's no sign that the U.S. will scale back military or intelligence assistance to Ukraine, both of which are very important to Kiev to continue fighting. President Trump stopped short of offering Tomahawk missiles, as you said, which had been Kiev's hope. And the anticipated U.S.-Ukraine drone deal wasn't finalized either, but that still appears to be on the table, as are the Tomahawks, but probably well into 2026 is when we can expect them. But arms shipments via Europe will continue, and EU officials have doubled down on their commitment to Ukraine's defense and European security.
I want to talk about those Tomahawk missiles because that seemed like Zelensky's major goal in meeting with President Trump at the White House last week. But in a recent interview, President Trump said, we need them for ourselves too, meaning those missiles. Do you think if the United States gave these missiles now, it would be a real turning point in the war?
Well, I think we've heard this in the past as well. I remember the first time around when ATACMS were not yet on the table, it was seen as a real sort of a deal breaker, something that was really going to move the needle. And I do believe that every little bit does help a great deal. It's not just the Tomahawks, but also the permission to use those Tomahawks to hit deep into Russian territory and Russian targets deep inside the country, which is very, very important to Ukraine, aside from actually getting those weapons. But aside from all of that, what continues to be critical for Kiev is this continued support and this pledge to continue supporting Ukraine no matter what, which did concern the Ukrainians a great deal when President Trump came back to the White House. But now we are seeing more of an alignment between the Europeans, the Americans, and obviously the Ukrainians in terms of being very much on the same page in terms of continued Western support toward Ukraine.
You and I have been talking about this for a while now, but it's like the whiplash that we get when we see the relationship between President Trump and Zelensky, because we remember that really aggressive meeting at the White House in February. It ended up ultimately in a screaming match. We've seen since friendlier meetings between Zelensky and Trump. This one was reportedly tense. It was a little chilly. Do you think that the tone and tenor that reportedly was in this meeting had anything to do with the fact that the day before, President Trump had a phone call with Putin?
It may have, but I think what also ended up becoming a problem in the scheme of things is the fact that after President Trump's call with President Putin, there was a call between Secretary Rubio and his Russian counterpart Lavrov, which did not go as well as both sides had anticipated, because they were actually hoping to meet today on Thursday, which is now also on hold, as is the Budapest summit. So I do think that when it comes to President Trump's thinking vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia and the broader ceasefire issue at hand, it very much depends on sort of the less conversation that he had, the less set of meetings that he has had, which very much colors his foreign policy, including vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine war. So the call perhaps didn't go as well as he had hoped with President Putin, but it was very clear to him that Putin was not going to put aside his maximalist demands. He was going to double down on those concessions that he was seeking to get from Kiev, which was then conveyed to the Ukrainian side. And obviously, none of those concessions were going to be acceptable to Kiev. There were essentially non-starters, and they're also non-starters for Ukraine's European allies.
I was going to ask you about that because it seems like, especially when it comes to this conflict, whoever was in Trump's ear last, whether it be Zelensky or Trump, it seems like Trump is more favorable to that side a little bit. A, do you think that's a fair characterization? And B, do you think Putin sees that and that's why he's calling Trump the day before? It seems like President Trump has even ruminated this over the past year or so, that it seems like Putin's kind of playing me a little bit. Do you think Putin sees that and is in fact playing him?
I think to a degree he is, and it's not just that Putin is playing President Trump, but in many ways Russia has been playing a lot of its sort of partners and not very friendly partners either over the past years. So it's not necessarily something that Putin is doing vis-a-vis Trump specifically. That said, the Russians have been sort of probing for some flexibility on the US side, because at the beginning, when Trump was coming back to the White House, there was an understanding in Moscow that essentially Trump was going to be seen as far more pro-Kremlin rather than his predecessor, President Biden, and therefore the hopes were very high in Russia that somehow they would be able to snatch a deal that would be very valuable and also very favorable to the Russian side. That did not happen. And I do think that the gap that we are seeing at the moment, this enduring gap, is actually growing in terms of expectations, which is, I think, the main reason why the US called off the planned talks with Russia in Budapest. Even, despite that phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin that didn't yield any breakthrough on a ceasefire, there were still hopes that the meeting would happen. And then afterwards, when Secretary of State Rubio spoke with his Russian counterpart, probing for flexibility, it was very clear that Russia would essentially refuse to budge on its key demands, insisting that any negotiations cover a broad set of issues, including NATO posture, deployments, something both Washington and Kiev, as well as Ukraine's allies in Europe, see as unacceptable. And obviously the territorial concessions that we just talked about a moment ago. So given this lack of progress, as well as the latest announcement of new US sanctions on the Russian energy sector, the summit preparations for Trump-Putin meeting in Budapest are suspended indefinitely, but also we are entering more broadly, when it comes to this war, a new stalemate in diplomacy, which was not the case earlier this year when you and I were having very regular conversations, because there was a more dynamic process. And now it has stopped when it comes to Russia-US specifically, but the other side of the coin is that we're seeing positive developments and positive dynamic when it comes to Washington and Kiev's willingness to be very much on the same page compared to what we saw even in the Oval Office between Zelensky and Trump that you just referenced a moment ago.
To that point, President Trump had those whirlwind summits with Putin as well as Zelensky, and his hope was he wanted to wrap this war up. He wanted a ceasefire. He announced the Budapest summit with Putin. He backtracked on that. This is what he said. He said that he canceled it because it didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like we were going to get to the place we have to get, so I canceled it, but we'll do it in the future. And ever since those summer summits, Russia launched its largest attack on Ukraine yet that this war has ever seen. So do you think that Russia is serious about peace, A, and B, do you think Trump realizes, hey, Russia might not be serious about peace at this moment?
I don't think that any of the conversations that you and I have had, Brittany, led either of us to believe when we unpacked these issues and the news headlines that Putin has been very serious about achieving peace in Ukraine at any point in time, really since not just the full-scale invasion, but actually 2014 onward, Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, etc. So in that respect, I don't think that he is in any rush at the moment. Yes, the punitive measures, including the latest US sanctions on the two major energy companies in Russia, are going to hurt longer term. But even so, at the moment, he doesn't feel enough pressure unless he can get the concessions that he wants from the Ukrainians, which is very clear to him that he cannot at the moment. Because essentially, what are the concessions that he wants? The major thing that he wants is Ukraine's capitulation, which is just not going to happen. Ukraine is not in a position at the moment, especially given that the Europeans are standing by its side. The US and Europe are very much aligned now more than ever under President Trump's second term. So we're seeing that Ukrainians are not desperate, and Putin is seeing the same thing as well. So he's in no rush. I think he wants to continue making the incremental gains on the battlefield. He wants to play a little bit sort of harder to get. And he also understands that without simplifying this, and I certainly don't want to simplify this too much, but even so, the fact that the Nobel Peace Prize was not given to President Trump, I do think that in many ways, this has sort of eased some of the urgency that we were seeing earlier in the year when he was in a rush to have some sort of a ceasefire in place. Now, where the interests between the Ukrainians and the Europeans and the US side align, among other things, is the fact that I think both camps, acting sort of more in unison now, are seeing that the only value will be a good deal for Ukraine. Otherwise, a ceasefire that falls through 2-3 weeks later is not really going to be beneficial. And frankly, if the US continues to broker this peace process, it doesn't look great for President Trump either if suddenly that ceasefire is violated by Russia in no time, and essentially his reputation, President Trump's reputation, is also on the line at that point. So he wants to be able to get something clearer, and I think the US messaging here is very, very clear for the first time in months. There will need to be real concrete deliverables and a more reasonable Russian position and terms before moving forward at the top leadership level. So the bar for a summit, and more broadly for this ongoing ceasefire/peace process, is much, much higher now than it was even a few months ago.
And to that point, I think it's really important to see where each side is on the battlefield. And I think that impacts their willingness to go to the negotiating table. Because we remember back in February, one of the most memorable quotes from that explosive White House meeting between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky was Trump saying to Ukraine, flat out, you don't have the cards. Zelensky was asked about that recently in an NBC interview, and he said, I'm not losing this war, and Putin isn't winning. Where is each side right now when it comes to this war? Who exactly is winning and losing, or does it seem more of a tit for tat where there is no clear winner or loser?
Well, very broadly on the battlefield specifically, we're seeing Russian incremental advances that continue in Donetsk, for example. But Ukrainian defensive lines are holding, and they're bolstered by ongoing Western military, financial, and political support that we're seeing. So in many ways, I do think that neither side is winning at the moment, but it's come down to sort of Russia continuing to make some gains, some territorial gains, even if they're not huge. And on the other side, the Ukrainians are still able to hold out and to hold the line. So while that continues, and that could be a long process, I do think that it will drag out the peace process because neither side is going to be desperate to essentially give in to the pressure that the other may put on it. Especially when it comes to Russia, they can keep going for a while, even with these sanctions, which are certainly significant, but even so, they can continue to keep going. And the Ukrainians, with all of the Western pledges that we've seen over the past weeks and months, Ukraine is also able to hold the line. So We are going to probably continue seeing this intense fighting on the battlefield, which we expect to persist well into next year and probably well into the middle of 2026. So in the meantime, it'll be very difficult to see either side desperate enough that they will actually be willing to come to the table, because both sides, both the Russian and the Ukrainian sides, would actually have to be willing to give something up that is major, that is very meaningful to it, in order to reach some sort of an agreement at the negotiating table, or at least to have a substantial conversation that goes beyond what we've seen before. And just one last thing I'd like to add on that, and on President Trump's views specifically, what we're seeing lately is that not only has he lost patience with Vladimir Putin, as you said, sort of playing him or trying to play him, and to outsmart him and to stretch the process, but also I do feel that at this point he has lost patience with holding meetings for the sake of meetings. I think he got the photo ops that he wanted out of the summit in Alaska, and he doesn't really need to keep shaking hands with Putin if Putin is not going to be willing to give him something at least. I'm seeing that as a very sort of long-term possibility, and probably not something that is on the table for the time being, given that we've just seen this new set of very significant sanctions on Russia's energy sector that is going to make it less likely that Putin will necessarily want to come to the table immediately. At some point, if this starts to hurt him, will he? Yes, probably. But I don't feel that this is something that he's going to tackle as a Russia-Ukraine issue, but rather as a sort of way of trying to figure out a normalization tactic or a path forward for Russia and the US specifically. It'll always be in some way sort of colored by this US-Russia relationship that will at least be used in the Russian rhetoric and in the Russian media headlines far more so than Russia-Ukraine, which is seen as more of a domestic issue for Vladimir Putin.
To that point, I'm not going to try to get into the head of Vladimir Putin, but if I am Putin right now, I'm seeing the United States slap two of my largest oil companies with sanctions. The Treasury Department said that further sanctions could still come. The summit with Trump, he canceled it. He says, I'm not serious. I mean, what is it going to take to get Putin to the table?
I think what it's going to take to get him to the table, longer term, yes, punitive measures will continue to probably hurt over time. Let's see if that's enough to actually make Russia hurt so much that they need to come to the table because they understand that they can't keep going forever. I don't think we are there yet. So it's probably going to take some battlefield weaknesses or losses on the Russian side that would make Putin reconsider the timeline. Because at the moment, we're really all talking about the timeline. How much longer can Russia keep fighting, and how much longer can Ukraine keep essentially holding the line? So it'll take a little while for us to see either side in a situation where they feel like they are willing to give something up, as I was saying earlier. So for Putin, it's really going to probably take some losses, or at least a forecast that is not very positive for Russia on the battlefield, for him to feel that it is now time to come to the table. But again, I don't see him couching this in terms of him essentially saying, I'm ready to talk about ending the war, but rather he will try to present this as an olive branch to President Trump to talk about a reset in relations between the US and Russia, and then within that conversation also discuss Ukraine, because otherwise he will be seen as a much weaker leader, not just abroad, but also domestically in Russia.
And in recent weeks, it's been good for President Trump when it comes to international diplomacy. He was hailed as the peacemaker for getting Hamas and Israel to agree to that ceasefire. Phase one of that ceasefire is still underway. It does seem tenuous right now. It seems like very delicate that it could break. But as of now, both sides are saying that they are holding that ceasefire. When you look at that agreement, does anything stick out to you? Are there any hints? Are there any signposts there that you can look at and compare to potentially what could happen with negotiations between Russia and Ukraine?
I think the fragility of the ceasefire, there are some parallels there. Obviously, these are very different situations. Also, the US is far more invested, has been historically, in its relations with Israel rather than, let's say, Russia. It's slightly different when it comes to Ukraine, especially now that we're seeing this US pivot in terms of supporting Ukraine and being more vocal about supporting Ukraine under President Trump, which was always the case under President Biden, but not so much President Trump since he came back to the White House. What would the other thing that I do think is going to be similar is how we think about, who is actually going to be violating the ceasefire. Because here it is very clear that it would be in Russia's interest to violate the ceasefire in Ukraine rather than the other way around, because it is certainly in Ukraine's and President Zelensky's interest to actually keep peace in the country. So probably it would take one or the other side to take that wrong step in the wrong direction, and it's likelier to come from Moscow, and that will probably impact President Trump's thinking in terms of whether or not he will then be willing to go back to the negotiating table and to renegotiate peace after he has done it once. When it comes to Gaza, when it comes to Israel, it'll probably be a little bit different, where the US is so invested that they will, in some way, I do believe, and I'm certainly no Middle East expert, but still I do believe that there will be more at stake for the US, and they will continue to stay very focused and very involved in that process. When it comes to Russia, Ukraine, if Russia actually does not deliver on a promise that it may eventually make to President Trump, if they sign on to a ceasefire deal, then there will be less likelihood of President Trump giving Putin another chance, yet another chance. And that relationship that may or may not be repaired in some way between the US and the Russian sides, I think that will essentially no longer be on the table, because President Trump eventually will realize that Putin is not necessarily an actor that he can trust, that he can make deals with, that the Russian side will be willing to honor.
And I love speaking with you because you have been dead on in every conversation. And the major takeaways I have with you in our conversations is Russia instigated this war and they are not really itching for peace at the moment. And I think what we're going to see based on this conversation is more feet dragging from Putin, feet dragging from Russia, this war dragging on. What exactly then are you looking out for next?
Well, looking ahead, Brittany, I think we should watch for more coordinated economic pressure from the US and Europe, which we're already seeing. And we need to continue monitoring battlefield developments very, very closely, because that's where the war is actually unfolding. So that is going to dictate whether or not and when Putin is going to be willing to really come to the table with something substantial to discuss. So while fighting on the battleground will continue, any real movement in terms of restarting peace negotiations would require Russia to narrow its demands and accept a more limited scope for a ceasefire, as well as its expectations for Western involvement, which is obviously something that for Putin has been a non-starter for a while. But eventually he may have to understand that he'll have to accept some of that as a given. But that does not seem likely at this stage, at least. So for now, with the indefinite postponement of the Budapest summit, the gap between the US and Russia, or the growing gap, I would say, shows no sign of closing. So the path toward a meaningful ceasefire remains long and complicated. That is, until Russia feels enough pressure to dial down on its maximalist demands and come to the table with something a bit more reasonable, a bit more tangible to resume talks. Otherwise, we are going to stay in this stalemate, at least diplomatically speaking, for the time being.
Well, Tinatin, I always appreciate our conversations. Thank you so much for your expertise, and until next time.
Thank you so much.